Think about the first time you got invited somewhere where you had to dress up fancy. Can you remember something like that? Maybe it was a wedding or a funeral, maybe even coming to church sometime, or some special formal dinner where you had to put on your snazziest clothes and find your flaming suspenders to impress everybody in the room and dress up just right. Can you recall a time where you needed to dress up real fancy? Questions start to come to mind. I remember thinking to myself, what should I wear? What time am I supposed to be there? I got to make sure I know the location of where this place is so that I go to the right place. And what happens if I don't fit in? Because if I show up in my crazy Christmas sweater, but everyone else is wearing formal wear, I'm not going to fit. I need to make sure that I fit the room. And there's all these questions and all this stress and all this pressure. This is the illustration that Jesus used when he described his kingdom. He taught stories, these parables with spiritual lessons, in order to help us to understand what it's like to enter into and live in his kingdom. And the illustration that he used shows up in Matthew 22. It starts in this way. In Matthew 22, he said, "The kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a king who prepared a great wedding feast for his son. And when the banquet was ready, he sent his servants to notify those who were invited." Can you picture that with me? I don't know if you've been to a wedding before. Many of us have. We have an idea in our mind about what a wedding would look like, but this isn't just any wedding. This is a wedding of the richest person around. It's the king. And this is certainly special because this invitation didn't come from just a friend or relative or somebody who felt obligated, like, well, I wouldn't normally invite them, but I kind of feel like I have to, and so they're going to show up at the wedding. Maybe they won't come. I don't know. But this isn't just anybody. This is the king who rules the universe. He doesn't just own some castle or banquet hall. He doesn't just have a little bit of snacks on the side. This is the guy who owns everything. The Lord, the God, the King of Kings, who rules over everything, everywhere. And he has decided to throw a spare no expense party and invite you to attend. He wants you to be at his party. At the party of the millennia. So just picture it with me. They've got live music. They've got an endless buffet. They've got all the decorations and the dance floor is laid out there. And now there's an invitation that's come to you and it has your name on it. Probably written in that fancy, curvy, swirly calligraphy font, right? Why on earth would the end of verse 3 look this way? See there with me, the end of verse 3. But Jesus said, they all refused to come. Now, that doesn't make sense to me because I know some people like parties, some people don't, but this isn't going to be I'm not sure if I'll like it party. This is going to be exactly the way that you would love being at this party. Everything is wonderful about it, but yet it doesn't say, well, some people didn't show up. It was a little bit less than what they expected. No, everybody on the invitation list, they all refused to come. Why? Why on earth would someone refuse an invitation to the king? Why would someone refuse an invitation to our God who is extending to you and to me an invitation to his party and to his kingdom? Because remember, this isn't actually a story about a party. It's an illustration about his kingdom that he has invited you and I to be a part of. Why refuse? And Jesus gave actually several reasons why some people said no to that invitation. Some people are busy. I understand that, especially this time of year, right? Mary Jo had mentioned just a minute ago about how we don't necessarily need more things on our schedule. We're not sitting around bored. Many of us have a schedule that is already overflowing. And so for these folks, they had work to complete. Jesus said that they had possessions they needed to manage or relationships that they prioritized over the one that was inviting them to this party. And so for one reason or another, these different kinds of busyness just kind of got in the way. It wasn't necessarily like those things were evil. They were just louder than the invitation to come to the party. And so these folks, because they were busy, said, nope, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to be there. Well, that's not the only reason. There's some people who they don't recognize the urgency. Yeah, okay, there's a party, but big deal. Stuff happens all the time. Is that something that really I want to change my schedule to go and be there? Maybe I could just I'll get to it later. I have this invitation, and I'll respond later on. There's always another chance. I mean, if we're talking about God, if we're talking about his patience and his grace, then he's like a very patient God. And so I figured maybe I could just wait. It doesn't feel urgent to me. I could put it off a little while. And some folks, they don't see any need to be a part of his kingdom or a part of his church. The invitation is there, but yet there's no pressing need in their minds. And it's not so much that people say no. Some people just kind of say, well, I mean, not now. It's not urgent, is it? Just not now. Maybe later. God's invitation is patient. God is patient when he extends that invitation to you and me. But it's not permanent. And there's a difference between patience and permanence. And time is running out. There is a sense of urgency, but not everyone recognizes that. So why else might somebody refuse to come to this party? Well, for some folks, it's because they don't want to give control to the king. So for us to say yes to God's invitation is for us to say, okay, well then I'm going to do the thing that you asked me to do. If he's the king and I'm one of the citizens in his kingdom, then I need to treat him as the king. And well, boy, I don't know if I'm really quite ready to do that, some people would think themselves, because it's kind of scary to surrender. I mean, I like being in control of things. I like being the one who gets to make decisions, and when somebody else comes along and makes decisions, I might not like the thing that they decide. I might not be able to trust this king. I might not be able to trust this God. Who knows? They're wondering to themselves, and allegiance to this kind of a king can be costly, because a king, especially a king over the universe, has the right to demand everything from me, and his values and priorities sometimes conflict with ours. There are some people who they'll get that invitation, but they'll choose not to come. They won't accept that invitation and come because they're just concerned about giving up control. It's not really so much that they disbelieve in God. We're not talking so much about disbelief as we are talking about control of our own lives. And can we really trust God to be in control of us? I'll give you another reason, a fourth reason why some people choose not to accept this invitation. They underestimate the value of what is being offered. They treat that invitation as, well, that's nice. Yeah, it's nice. Maybe it's not priceless. And if I get an invitation that was nice, I might say yes, I might say no. But if I get an invitation to something that is priceless, to a party and to a kingdom that is worth more than anything else ever, that means much different to me than, well, it's nice. I mean, it was nice that you invited me. I appreciate it. Thanks. And there's this competition of value. For some people, when we undervalue the invitation that God is extending to us, then that invitation it's competing with our comfort. It's competing with our familiarity. It's competing with fear, all kinds of things in our lives, like our misplaced priorities. And so this competition tugs and pulls on us. And if I truly valued his invitation as being priceless, then it would be easy for me to say, okay, yeah, then I'll go. I'll do it. I'll say yes to the king. I'll be a part of his kingdom. But if I don't see the value, if I don't recognize the value in it, I'm not quite ready to say yes to what would actually end up being worth more than anything else. A fifth reason why some people refuse to come is that they don't like the messenger. Now, in the parable, in the illustration Jesus used, he said that the invitation came from the king, and that represents God, but the invitations came by means of servants of that king. The king wasn't going around door to door saying, hey, I've got an invitation for you. Someone on behalf of the king comes to you and says, I'm going to invite you to come to the king, not my party, but to the king's party. Not to my kingdom, but to the king's kingdom. And sometimes those messengers, those servants of the king, they're a little shady. Sometimes they're just kind of rotten, and I know about what you did last weekend. I know about your past. I know about your present. I know about your language. I know about your faults. I know about the things that you think that you keep hidden, but you don't. And I don't like that messenger. I don't like that servant. And for some of us, we've been hurt. We've been hurt by the servants of that king. We've experienced church hurt. Maybe you have. I know I have experienced this before. And we see hypocrisy among the church, among the servants of the king. We see this sense of, we feel this sense of resentment. And the resentment towards the messengers, towards the servants, then just kind of spreads and leaks out onto being resentment towards the king. And really the king, I mean, he's great, but the servants, they kind of color our idea and our understanding of what the king's like. And if these servants, these people of the church are lousy, then why would I want to be a part of that party? Why would I want to be a citizen of that kingdom when the servants who are supposed to be the servants of the king are acting the way that they do? And it's just gross and it's hurtful. And so they end up rejecting the king because of the way that they feel about his servants. Some people end up rejecting God because of the way that we feel about his church. And there's one more reason, a sixth reason why some people refuse to come. And this one I actually think is kind of scary. The sixth reason why some people choose not to accept the invitation is because in their minds, they think they already said yes. They think they already did accept the invitation, but they didn't. You see, if we don't accept the king's invitation on the king's terms, then we're not really accepting the king's invitation. If he said show up on Tuesday at 10, but we decided to show up on Thursday at 3, we have not accepted the invitation of the king. It's got to be on his terms. And for some people, we need to be very careful because this invitation comes with very specific terms. And the response that God is looking for the people who he's inviting to his kingdom is very specific. And so there are some folks who think, oh yeah, sure, I already said yes. I'm already going to the party. I'm in. I'm a part of the kingdom. But you might not be. And it's especially clear you're not if you're not accepting the invitation on the king's terms. And so for these reasons and for a bunch of other reasons why, there are people who just reject the invitation from the king. This invitation to be a part of his party and to be a part of his kingdom. And yet still, Jesus said in this illustration, the king kept asking. It wasn't one time that he sent the servants out with the invitations. He sent them out over and over. And that's kind of like the way that God does with us, too. He continues to invite you to be a part of his kingdom, to be involved and adopted into his family. God's invitation to us is a repeated invitation. So then in verse 8, Jesus continued it this way. He said that the king said to his servants, so the illustration continues, the king said to his servants, the wedding feast is ready, woohoo! And the guests I invited, well, they're not worthy of the honor. Why? Because they all rejected the invitation, okay? That's what we're talking about. Now, he says to the servants, go out to the street corners and invite everyone you see. And so the servants brought in everyone they could find, good and bad alike. And the banquet hall was filled with guests. Those invited guests, the first round, who rejected the invitation, they're not coming. But the king was still going to be throwing his party. He was still king, and this was still his kingdom. So then he ends up extending the invitation to more people, to other people. And he's not running a background check on them. He's not seeing their resume and asking for references. It's a come as you are, whoever you are, on the street corner kind of a person. Who in our culture might we see hanging around on a street corner? That's the kind of person who he's willing to say, you know what, even that person, why don't you come be a part of my party? Why don't you come and be a part of my kingdom? Because it didn't stop with just those who behaved well or cleaned themselves up nicely or fit into a particular category. It was an invitation that was repeated, and it was an invitation that was extended to everyone so that the banquet hall would be filled with guests. So the servants went out and found others, and it was really anybody who was willing to be included. But it didn't end there. Now, I like this illustration. I like this parable that Jesus used because we like the idea of being included, right? Well, maybe if I didn't make the first cut, or maybe if I said no when God asked me the first time around, then maybe I'll make the second cut, and maybe I'll get included with the everybody category because we all kind of fit into that category. And it feels nice to be invited, right? It feels nice to be included by a king who is very generous, a king who is very gracious, a king who wants to shower blessings upon us. We like this, and so it feels good. And if the parable ended right there, we could all smile and go home happy, but it doesn't. It doesn't end there. This illustration Jesus used about his kingdom to help you and I understand what it's like to enter into and live in his kingdom, it continued further. There's more to it than this. And it's really important, very important, that we understand this next part because it applies to you and to me. It applies to everyone, whether you believe it or not. This part that I'm going to show you here next applies whether you've been showing up at church every weekend for your entire life, or if this is the first time that you've been here ever, or the first time in a long time, or somewhere in between. Wherever you fall into any of those categories, this applies to you and to me and to everybody. This part's for you. In verse 11, Jesus said, "But when the king came to meet the guests," that's the second round of guests, not the people who said no, but the people who ended up showing up when he extended it to everybody. When the king came in to meet the guests, he noticed a man who wasn't wearing the proper clothes for a wedding. Well, that's kind of weird because it doesn't work that way in our culture. Right? If I invite you to come to my wedding, then you either change into some nice clothing, or you go and you purchase some nice clothing, or you find at least the nicest thing that you have so that you can put on your suit or your dress, or like fix your makeup and your hair, and then get your nice shoes and your fire suspenders, whatever it takes so that you can look nice. That's our culture. It isn't how weddings worked 2,000 years ago and on the other side of the planet. You see, for them, when you would get invited to a wedding, the host provided the fancy clothing to you. You didn't have to clean yourself up first. They'd do it to you. They'd do it for you, so that everybody who's included is able to fall into the, yes, I'm wearing the proper clothes category. But here's the king looking at his guests, and he's seeing, wait a minute, I invited that person, and they showed up, they accepted the invitation, but when I offered to help them to change so that they could fit into the occasion, so they could fit into the kingdom, they neglected to accept that change in their life. They chose not to wear what the king had offered to them. And they refused to be suitable for the occasion. So the king says in verse 12, the next line here, the king says, "Friend, how is it that you're here?" Doesn't even make sense. How is it that you're here without wedding clothes? How can you be? I mean, I provided them to you. I gave you everything that you needed so that you would have the appropriate clothing. How is it that you're here without wedding clothes? But the man had no reply. Why? Because there was no excuse. He had no excuse left, no reason not to be wearing the proper clothing for this fancy, special, wonderful party of the millennia. It was provided to him, and he had just decided not to change, accept the invitation, but refused to change. Those fancy wedding clothes represent our repentance. That's the biblical word that means to turn away from sin, to turn to God. They represent the way that we have a new allegiance to the king, instead of our allegiance where it used to be either to ourselves or to some false god or some false religion or the lack of completely, whatever it may be, but it represents this new allegiance, the change in our lives from who we used to be to who we are becoming, that God is helping us to become and providing everything we need in order to fit, to be proper, to experience the fullness of the blessing of this party that he is throwing for you and for me. And some of us are here today, we're willing to visit the king. We're willing to go to a celebration, to a party. Maybe we'll show up for a wedding or a Christmas holiday. Maybe we'll go to a funeral or for Easter. But we look exactly like the kind of people who aren't a part of the party. We look exactly like the kind of people who aren't a part of the kingdom. Because while we've said yes and we've come to peek in and be there at the table, we have not accepted the change that the king has offered to us. Our habits remain unchanged. Our language looks just as it did before we even heard of the king. Our values and our priorities have not yet been saturated with those of the king. So we accept the invitation, but we neglect the change into the clothes that the king provides, and we don't allow God to change us to fit into his kingdom. There's one thing I want to teach you today, just one. And so I'm hoping that this is something you could remember, glue it into your brain if you want, you could write it down. The one thing I want to teach you today is come as you are, but don't stay as you were. Come as you are. But don't stay as you were. Jesus never told people to clean themselves up before coming. He didn't. But he never let people remain unchanged either. God welcomes us as we are, and isn't that good news? For all of us who have experienced the mercy of God, it is good news for us to know He welcomes us just as we are, with all of our faults and brokenness, with our biggest mistakes and regrets, with the nasty things that we have done and that have been done to us. All of it. He welcomes us just as we are, but He loves us too much to leave us there. That's the kind of King who is inviting you and me and everyone to come into His kingdom. Come as you are, but don't stay as you were. In verse 13, Jesus continued, He said, the King said to His aides about this person who refused to be changed, He said to His aides, bind his hands and feet and throw him into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Like teeth grinding, ugh, I hate that, right? Weeping, you get the idea. It's not just like I'm crying a little. It's like I'm sobbing. I've completely lost my composure. Weeping and gnashing of teeth, outer darkness. This is the imagery that is used consistently by God when He talks about eternal death, when He talks about what it is to be separated from God for eternity. Sometimes we call it hell. This is the imagery that Jesus used in His illustration here for those who do not have forgiveness, for those who do not have salvation. And it comes with a warning. Refusing transformation while claiming the invitation gets you thrown out of the party. Catch it. Refusing the transformation, that's the change that God is offering to us, while claiming the invitation. Sure, I'll come, I'll peek in. If we refuse the transformation while accepting the invitation, what's it get us? Thrown out of the party. That's not where I want to be. It's not where you want to be either. Don't peek in to the King's celebration here today and remain unchanged. Come as you are. But don't stay as you were. I want you to ask yourself a few questions. Ask yourself, what in my life am I treating as more urgent or more valuable than God's invitation right now? Is there something? Now be honest with yourself. I'm not going to ask you to say it out loud, but at least be honest with yourself. What is it that you're treating as more urgent or more valuable than God's invitation to you to enter in to His party and to His kingdom? Are you ready to accept that invitation? Not just to say yes to a party, but to say yes to the King, to accept His rule over your life, to say yes to Him? Well, then go to Him and surrender to Him. Don't just reflect on it. Don't just think about it, but make a decision and act upon it. There's your first question. What am I treating as more urgent or more valuable than God's invitation? The second question I want you to ask yourself is this. Where am I enjoying God's invitation but resisting His influence? Sure, I'll sit down at the table. I'll enjoy the buffet. That sounds fantastic. I like the music. I might even request a few songs. I'll be there. I'll peek in. I'll eat the food and sing a little, but I refuse to change into the clothing that the King offers me. Where is that happening in your life? Where am I enjoying God's invitation but resisting His influence? Is He changing your life to look more and more like His Son, Jesus Christ? If your life looks the same as it did last Christmas, then the answer is no. You've accepted, sure, I'll show up, but you're resisting that influence where He's offering to you and to me everything we need. And it's for your blessing, and it's for your benefit. It's for our benefit to experience the fullness of God's blessing so that we don't just show up and peek in and then go about the rest of our lives as if nothing had changed. Come as you are, but don't stay as you were. Don't skip the invitation because you don't feel ready or you feel like you're unworthy, and don't fool yourself into thinking that you can enjoy the party without allowing the King to change you. Jesus doesn't leave space for neutral ground. Sometimes we do. Sometimes His church does. Sometimes preachers do. But Jesus doesn't leave space for neutral ground. You're either accepting the invitation on God's terms or you're refusing it. And you got to choose. So come and receive and allow yourself to be changed. Come as you are, but don't stay as you were. And when you do, you will step out of isolation and into belonging. You will trade striving for security. You'll exchange shame for friendship with God, and you will find your place where you belong, where you are fully satisfied, where you enjoy the fullness of the blessing of God at his table. This is Jesus' kingdom. This is treasure.